Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we are stepping into Versailles in the spring of 1774, a palace of mirrors where splendour once seemed eternal. But look closely, those mirrors now reflect something far different than glory. They reflect the rot of a kingdom, the stench of a body decaying from within, and a monarchy already collapsing under the weight of its own excess. Louis XV, once hailed as le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, was by then no longer beloved at all. He lay stricken with smallpox, his flesh erupting in sores that oozed with such foulness that even seasoned attendants fled the chamber. The odour was so overwhelming that tapestries had to be torn down, windows flung open, and still the air was unbreathable. Those who had once bowed low before him now scrambled to escape, unwilling to inhale the scent of a sovereign's demise. It is easy to forget that this monstrous end began with innocence. Louis had ascended to the throne as a boy of 5, wide-eyed, fragile, carrying the hopes of a kingdom weary from the endless wars of his great-grandfather, the Sun King. He had once been the very embodiment of France's longing for renewal. Yet here, 60 years later, his very body seemed to bear witness against him. This is not merely the story of one king's physical collapse. It is the story of how the moral and political decay of a monarchy can take on flesh, how the disintegration of a man can foreshadow the implosion of a regime. Versailles, built as a theatre of power, had become a theatre of horror. The king's death chamber no longer functioned as a ritual stage for divine monarchy, but as a grotesque demonstration that even kings rot like common men. And the horror was not confined to smell or sight, it was psychological. Louis, who throughout his life had been obsessed with image and etiquette, ordered the mirrors of his chamber to be covered, unable to bear the reflection of his own ruined face. The court built on ceremony and ritual service simply unravelled. Attendance at his bedside dwindled. Silence replaced the elaborate rhythms of court life. The gilded palace became a mausoleum even before the king drew his final breath. But to understand why his death carried such force, why the people of Paris did not mourn but celebrated, why churches did not toll solemn bells but stood quiet, we must step back. We must see how a king once adored became despised, and how the collapse of his reign became a rehearsal for the French Revolution itself. So tonight, we begin not with the stinking deathbed, but with the child placed on a throne in 1715. For only by tracing the arc from innocent boy to decaying monarch can we grasp the deeper truth that absolute power left unchecked corrodes not just institutions, but the very body of the one who wears the crown. Hey there! Before we go on, tap, like and subscribe if these stories make you pause, reflect or smile. And now, tell me, where in the world are you joining me from tonight, and what hour has history found you at? I want to hear your story. The year 1715 was both an ending and a beginning. On September 1st, Louis XIV, the Sun King who had ruled France for 72 years, finally died. His reign had dazzled Europe with grandeur, but it had also drained the nation with endless wars and suffocating debts. The halls of Versailles, which once shone with his choreographed brilliance, now echoed with fatigue. Into this vacuum stepped a child. His great-grandson Louis, barely 5 years old, orphaned by illness, suddenly bore the weight of a crown and of a people who had known no other monarch in living memory. Imagine it, for 3 generations France had known one son, one king, one figure to structure life around. Now the people turned to a boy, their hopes cast upon a child too young to write his own name clearly, too small to understand what it meant to rule Europe's most powerful kingdom. During his minority, the reins of power were held by Philippe d'Orléans, the regent. His governance brought a brief exhale after the exhausting wars of the Sun King. There was more tolerance for free speech, less rigid censorship, and attempts at stabilising the economy, including John Law's infamous financial experiments. For a while, this looser, more pragmatic governance gave France breathing space, and the child king was not neglected. Louis XV was given the most polished education France could design. He was tutored in languages Latin, Italian, Spanish to prepare him for diplomacy. He studied mathematics, geography, and the arts of war. He was instructed in courtly manners so elaborate they seemed a language of their own, when to bow, when to smile, how to move through ritual with grace. His instructors noted his intelligence, his quick memory, his capacity for charm. To many it seemed destiny had placed a capable mind in a fragile frame. But more than education, Louis inherited expectation. The nation looked at the boy and saw more than a child, they saw redemption. The final years of Louis XIV had been marked by famine, taxation and grief. Now France dreamed that this child might embody renewal. He was called le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, a title not given in jest but in genuine affection. He became in the imagination of his people the promise of a gentler king, one who might combine authority with compassion. In this projection lay a dangerous seed, for what child could bear the burden of repairing a kingdom already cracked by debt, war and inequality, and what nation having cast its dreams onto one boy would do when reality proved less radiant than the dream? For now, though, optimism reigned. Court festivals welcomed the young monarch. Paintings depicted him not as a vulnerable orphan, but as a miniature sovereign draped in ermine, his crown too large, yet his eyes shining with a confidence he could not possibly feel. In him France saw continuity, even immortality. If the Sun King had set, another sun would rise. Yet history is never so kind. Beneath the glitter of regency and the rituals of royal childhood, shadows already lengthened, shadows of hesitation, of indulgence, of fragility that no education could fully erase. The cracks in the marble had begun, though few yet noticed. In 1723, at the age of 13, Louis XV was declared of age and assumed the reins of power. The boy who had been a symbol was now expected to be a sovereign. His first years as king seemed to fulfill every hope invested in him. He was handsome, quick-witted, and capable of charms so effortless it appeared divine. His courtiers whispered that France had been blessed with a ruler both intelligent and kind, a prince who could heal the wounds left by his great-grandfather's long wars. To cement his legitimacy, Louis married Marie Leszczyńska, daughter of the deposed King of Poland. Though politically arranged, the marriage was celebrated with genuine warmth. Marie, modest and pious, contrasted with the intrigues of Versailles. She gave birth to numerous children, ensuring the stability of the Bourbon line. For a kingdom still haunted by the spectre of dynastic uncertainty, this was no small comfort. In these years, Louis XV was more than a monarch. He was the living embodiment of renewal. His popularity earned him the affectionate title Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. Pamphlets, songs, and sermons alike described him as a gift from Providence. The people saw in him the dawn of a gentler authority, one that would soften the rigid absolutism of Louis XIV without still sacrificing France's grandeur. At Versailles, legitimacy was not simply inherited, it was performed daily. Louis learned the elaborate rituals that made monarchy visible. Each morning, the lever, the royal rising, was a stage upon which his body was displayed as sacred. Ministers, nobles, and servants filed in to witness the simple acts of washing, dressing, and greeting, each gesture carefully choreographed. To pour the king's water, to hold his shirt, to hand him a cane, these were not chores but privileges that marked one's place in the hierarchy of power. At night, the coucher repeated the performance in reverse, closing the royal day like the curtain falling on a theatre. Such ceremonies might appear hollow, yet they were the machinery of monarchy. They reminded all who watched that the king's body was the state itself. To be near him was to be near power. In these early years, Louis XV seemed to carry the role with grace, blending dignity with approachability. After the cold and distant final decades of the Sun King, the new monarch's warmth was received as a balm. But rituals also breed expectations. The French longed for a sovereign who would embody compassion as much as majesty. They wanted a king who would not merely rule but care, who would look upon their sufferings with the same benevolence he showed in ceremony. This was the seed of a dangerous intimacy, for the same affection that crowned him well-beloved could in time sour into betrayal when reality failed to match the dream. For the moment, however, hope prevailed. France enjoyed a sense of cultural vitality. Louis encouraged intellectual pursuits, supported the sciences, and patronized the arts. He appeared as the young monarch who might harmonize authority with Enlightenment, power with progress. Europe watched with admiration, and the French people, still weary of past austerities, believed their new king might be both sovereign and saviour. It was a fragile golden dawn, and like all dawns, it contained the certainty of shadows yet to come. The decline of Louis XV's reign did not arrive with a thunderclap. It began as a hairline crack in marble, barely visible at first, easy to dismiss, yet destined to spread until the entire edifice gave way. Observers of the young monarch noticed a peculiar hesitation. Where his great-grandfather Louis XIV had been decisive, sometimes ruthlessly, so Louis XV often delayed, deferred, or avoided decisions altogether. He leaned heavily on advisers' favourites and eventually mistresses, not merely for counsel but for direction. To some courtiers this seemed humility, to others weakness. The contrast with Louis XIV could not have been sharper. The Sun King had cultivated an image of iron discipline. He rarely allowed his private appetites to disrupt the public theatre of power. Even his mistresses were carefully staged within the myth of his majesty. Louis XV, however, sought escape from performance. Where his predecessor had enlarged Versailles into a stage of cosmic order, Louis carved out sanctuaries within its smaller, more intimate apartments tucked away behind gilded halls. Here, away from the ritualized gaze of courtiers, he indulged in pleasures that belonged not to the king, but to the man. The very architecture of Versailles reflected this shift. Access had always been political currency: who entered the king's chamber, who held the candle at the coucher, who was permitted to whisper in the corridor. Louis XIV had weaponized this system, using the theatre of constant visibility to keep nobles tethered to him. Louis XV inverted it. Power now flowed not through public spectacle but through private access. Those who could slip into his retreats favourites, confidants, mistresses, wielded influence invisible to the rest of the court. To the public this was invisible at first. France still saw its king on hunts at festivals and carefully arranged ceremonies. But behind the curtains, the machinery of governance was bending. Decisions were postponed or shaped by personal comfort. The monarch who had once been hailed as the well-beloved began to prefer indulgence to disciplined privacy, to presence, sanctuary to sovereignty. No single act betrayed the change. It was the slow accretion of choices, the reliance on trusted intimates rather than ministers, the avoidance of pressing financial reforms, the willingness to allow personal affection to guide state policy. Each was defensible in isolation, even forgivable. Together they marked a slider monarch withdrawing into the comforts of the private while the burdens of the public grew heavier. Like a crack spreading through stone, the shift was almost imperceptible. Yet those closest to power could already sense the tension. The aura of promise surrounding Louis XV remained intact for now, but beneath it the first fractures had begun to widen. In 1740, Europe plunged into turmoil with the outbreak of the War of the Austrian Succession. The death of Emperor Charles VI left his daughter Maria Theresa heir to the Habsburg lands, but her right was contested by hungry neighbours eager to test her strength. France, long wary of Habsburg power, seized the moment. The aim was simple in theory: curb Austria, elevate France's influence and block Britain's growing reach. But in practice, France entered the labyrinth without a map. Louis XV, still relatively young and eager to embody the vigour of kingship, joined the cause. Yet unlike the meticulously orchestrated wars of Louis XIV, where campaigns followed a clear design, this conflict was fractured from the start. Ministers quarrelled, court factions schemed, and strategy shifted with the tides of intrigue. The king himself, indecisive by nature, often let his personal alliances and favourites dictate choices that should have been guided by reason. At first there were victories. French troops triumphed at Fontenoy in 1745, where Louis appeared in person to rally his forces. His presence on the battlefield briefly rekindled affection at home. Pamphleteers declared him a new warrior king, and for a moment the old dream that he might unite majesty with valour seemed alive again. But the triumph was hollow. Behind the banners and drums lay disorganisation supplies, running thin soldiers unpaid and the nation drowning in debt. For ordinary French families, the war's cost was immediate and brutal. Taxes swelled, grain prices soared, and borrowed money poured into a conflict that seemed to expand without end. Merchants grumbled at disrupted trade, peasants bore the burden of levies, and resentment simmered quietly against a monarch who seemed to spend suns and silver without clear purpose. Inside Versailles, politics corroded strategy. Rival ministers undercut one another, generals jockeyed for favour, and decisions on the field were distorted by decisions in the boudoir. To many it appeared that France was bleeding not for glory or security, but for the petty intrigues of courtiers and the whims of favourites. When the war ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the disillusion was sharp. Despite years of blood and treasure, France returned most of its conquests. Victory had been achieved on the battlefield only to be undone at the negotiating table. French soldiers and citizens alike asked, what was it all for? Sons had perished, coffers were emptied. Yet the map of Europe looked much the same as before. This was the poison of victories without dividends. Military triumphs that yield no lasting reward corrode not just morale but mystique. A king's aura depends on more than battle cries. It depends on results that justify sacrifice. Louis XV, once the well-beloved, found the glow of Fontenoy dimming almost as quickly as it had appeared. The people began to sense that beneath the ceremonies and victories lay a hollow throne. The marble was still standing, but the crack had widened. If the War of the Austrian Succession eroded confidence in Louis XV's leadership, the years that followed attached a face to the erosion. Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour. She was not merely a mistress. She was a partner, a confidant, a force at court whose presence illuminated both the king's vulnerabilities and the monarchy's fragility. When she entered Versailles in 1745, the scandal was immediate. She was not of noble blood, but bourgeois, the daughter of a financier. For a court that still prided itself on the hierarchies of lineage, her ascent was an outrage. To the king she was witty, intelligent, and companionable. To his enemies she was a symptom of decline, a woman of common stock placed above dukes and princes, shaping affairs of state from a gilded boudoir. Pompadour's influence was undeniable. She organised salons where philosophers, artists, and statesmen mingled. Voltaire himself found her a patron. She guided France's artistic direction, commissioning porcelain works at Sèvres, sponsoring Rococo painters, and shaping the very aesthetic of the age. She left her mark not only in canvases and ceramics but in stone. The Petit Trianon at Versailles, later infamous under Marie Antoinette, began as her project, a private refuge where she could host the king away from the suffocating theatre of the main palace. Yet this intimacy, celebrated by some scandalised many. Pamphlets circulated mocking her origins and exaggerating her power. In taverns and markets her name was cursed as though she herself had emptied the treasury and lost France its colonies. It was easier for the public to fix outrage on a mistress than to untangle the machinery of ministerial incompetence and court intrigue. Gender made her a lightning rod, and the failures of war, the burdens of taxation, the humiliations of diplomacy, all were projected onto the figure of a woman who in truth often shielded the king from harsher confrontations. But within the palace, her power was real. She shaped appointments, influenced negotiations, and kept Louis insulated from dissent. Ministers discovered that courting her favour was often more decisive than producing sound policy. Behind every decree, many suspected Pompadour's hand. Whether or not this was always true, the perception was enough to corrode the dignity of governance. Pompadour herself bore the strain. Her letters reveal a woman acutely aware of her precarious position, adored in private, despised in public, envied in court. She remained loyal long after her romantic role ended, proving that her connection to Louis was deeper than desire. Yet loyalty could not shield either of them from growing bitterness in the streets. In the end, Pompadour became both symbol and scapegoat. She embodied the shift from monarchy as public theatre to monarchy as private indulgence. She revealed how access, not office, had become the currency of power. And she taught France a lesson it would not forget: when the sovereign hides behind favourites, the public will drag those favourites into the light as evidence of a kingdom's decay. The partnership gave Louis comfort, but it also deepened the fissure between king and people, feeding the perception that Versailles was no longer a palace of governance, but a stage where pleasures were dressed up as policy. If Louis XV's early reign still shimmered with promise, its foundation was already crumbling beneath the weight of numbers. War had swollen the debt until it became a living creature, devouring every fresh attempt at stability. France was rich in culture, land, and population, yet its finances resembled a leaking ship. Every tax raised seemed to vanish before it reached the treasury. Every new levy brought only a moment's reprieve. The core injustice lay in the system itself. Ordinary peasants and townsfolk carried the heaviest burdens, while the nobility and clergy, the very classes that owned most of the land, were shielded by privilege. The taille, the direct land tax, fell almost exclusively on the commoners. The vingtième, a so-called temporary 20th of income introduced during wartime, lingered long after the fighting ceased, gnawing at the earnings of artisans and merchants. Meanwhile, the collection of indirect taxes, the gabelle on salt, the aids on wine and goods, the tithes, was outsourced to private tax farmers who squeezed the people for profit before passing a fraction to the crown. To a minister studying the ledgers in Versailles, it was their arithmetic, deficits, loans, and repayments. But to a peasant in Burgundy, or a weaver in Rouen, it was hunger. Every abstract figure in Paris translated into bread not bought, debts, unpaid children sent to bed hungry. Resentment grew not only at the king, but at the glaring unfairness of a society where the privileged dined richly while the taxed starved. Reform was the obvious answer, and one finance minister after another attempted it. Silhouette Machault Maurice Horry, names that flickered briefly before being extinguished by resistance. Each tried to extend taxation to the privileged estates to rationalise the chaotic system. Each was crushed by the entrenched power of the nobility and clergy, who saw exemption not as a perk but as their birthright. The king, hesitant and conflict-averse, never pressed hard enough to force reform through, and so the machine ground on devouring lives as it devoured numbers. The disconnect between court and countryside widened. At Versailles, the deficit was discussed over gilded tables, numbers carried in neat columns. In the provinces, tax collectors accompanied by soldiers pried the last coins from villagers, sometimes seizing livestock or tools. Monetary abstraction became physical desperation. Every new war made the system more brittle. Every new loan carried heavier interest. The crown sold offices, pawned privileges, promised futures it could not deliver. Each desperate fix deepened the structural rot. By the 1750s, many in France understood that the monarchy's finances were not merely strained, they were unsustainable. What they did not yet know was that this unsustainability would one day detonate into revolution. But in Louis XV's time, the crisis was still a slow suffocation rather than an explosion. The king, more comfortable in his private apartments than in ministerial councils, allowed the problem to fester. He had inherited grandeur and debt alike from his great-grandfather, but where Louis IV had projected control, Louis XV radiated avoidance. Between sceptre and ledger, the ledger was winning. If the War of the Austrian Succession had already drained a France of treasure and trust, the 7 Years' War would strip it of something far more devastating, its global stature. What began in 1756 as another European contest with Britain and Prussia soon spread across oceans, engulfing colonies and seas, in a struggle some historians now call the First True World War. For France, the conflict revealed fatal weaknesses. His army, though large, was disorganised, and its navy, once formidable, could not match the industrial might and disciplined seamanship of Britain. French fleets were blockaded in their own harbours, their supply lines severed. Soldiers overseas fought bravely but often without reinforcements, while colonial garrisons watched the Union Jack rise, where the fleur-de-lis once flew. The humiliation was not confined to distant maps. In 1759, after the disastrous defeat at the Plains of Abraham, Canada was lost. To modern ears it may sound like geography, but in Paris it was identity. Canada meant forests richer than imagination, fur wealth beyond measure, and a symbol of France's reach across the Atlantic. When news spread that it was gone, the loss felt less like the fall of a colony, and more like the amputation of a limb. Louisiana followed, ceded to Spain, and with it the dream of a vast French America. In India, British victories eroded French trading posts until only fragments remained. By 1763, at the Treaty of Paris, France surrendered most of its overseas empire. It was not simply defeat, it was diminution. A nation that had once rivaled Rome in ambition now seemed confined, shrunken, mocked. And humiliation travelled fast. Coffeehouses buzzed with reports read aloud from gazettes. Maps in shop windows displayed each lost territory in stark lines, each shaded absence a reminder of decline. Soldiers returning from Canada and the Caribbean carried stories of starvation, poor leadership, and abandonment by Versailles. In these spaces, over pipes, pamphlets, and whispered conversations, the people of France digested global catastrophe as personal insult. Louis XV himself seemed unable to respond. At times he appeared more interested in the pleasures of Versailles than the pain of defeat. His absences were noted, his silence mocked. If Louis XIV had once embodied France's might, Louis XV now symbolised its impotence. The 7 Years' War did not just shrink France's empire, it shrank its monarch, and when kings shrink, the crown does not recover easily. By 1764, France's defeats abroad had shaken its prestige, but another blow came from within, a spiritual fracture that cut to the heart of the monarchy's legitimacy. That year, Louis XV ordered the expulsion of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, from France. To many across Europe, the Jesuits were more than a religious order. They were educators who ran schools for the sons of nobles and bourgeois alike, confessors who whispered counsel into the ears of kings and queens, missionaries who carried the gospel to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In France, they had long served as defenders of Catholic orthodoxy and guardians of loyalty to the crown. To banish them was not a mere administrative decision. It was an earthquake. The roots of the conflict were tangled in politics as much as theology. Rival factions at court resented Jesuit influence. Gallican thinkers who championed the independence of the French Church from Rome viewed the order as dangerously loyal to the Pope. Meanwhile, Jansenists, theologically austere and politically influential in the law courts, attack the Jesuits as lax, corrupt, and overpowerful. When financial scandals involving Jesuit missions overseas erupted, their enemies seized the chance to demand their expulsion. Louis XV, weary of conflict and increasingly detached, yielded. The expulsion pleased Jansenists and Gallicans, but alienated devout Catholics who had long trusted the order. In parishes and provinces, ordinary believers whispered that the king had betrayed the very guardians of the faith. For a monarch whose title included eldest son of the church, the move carried a deep symbolic wound. The timing could not have been worse. The king's personal scandals, his mistresses parading through Versailles, his reputation for indulgence already jarred with the image of a sacred sovereign. Now, by expelling the Jesuits, he seemed to sever himself from the church's most loyal servants. What had once been the monarchy's greatest shelter spiritual legitimacy was thinning. For centuries, France had been bound by the idea that the king ruled not only by law, but by divine right upheld by the guardians of the altar. With the Jesuits gone, that aura dimmed. The faithful began to see their monarch not as protector of the faith, but as another flawed ruler swayed by faction and intrigue. It was a subtle shift, but a devastating one. When religion no longer sanctifies monarchy, monarchy becomes politics alone, and politics without sanctity is a fragile crown indeed. As Louis XV's authority faltered in the 1760s, another force gathered strength: the Enlightenment. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Their words questioned everything the monarchy claimed as natural divine right, noble privilege, clerical immunity. What began in salons and academies seeped into workshops and cafes, until the ideas of reason and liberty became common currency. The Crown's response was instinctive censorship. Royal decrees banned books, printers were fined, and the Police des Livres prowled Paris, seizing manuscripts and interrogating booksellers. Yet repression only sharpened appetite. A banned book became more alluring than a permitted one. A confiscated pamphlet promised more truth than a licensed sermon. In trying to silence the philosophes, the monarchy made them prophets. Clandestine networks did the rest. Swiss presses in Geneva churned out forbidden texts which were smuggled across the French border, in barrels, say, carts and false-bottomed trunks. Provincial libraires risked fines and prison to distribute them. In Paris, underground booksellers slipped volumes beneath counters, or loaned them discreetly to trusted customers. A single copy of Rousseau's Social Contract might pass through dozens of hands, whispered over by candlelight, debated in taverns, absorbed like contraband scripture. Censorship created not silence but suspicion. Citizens learned to read with a double vision what the state permitted and what it feared. The genre of the forbidden taught readers to treat monarchy itself as a suspect text. Every ban suggested guilt, every prosecution confirmed weakness. The king, once the fountain of law, now looked like a frightened censor scrawling black lines across pages he could not understand. The irony was brutal. The very ideas Louis XV tried to contain, reason, equality, liberty, spread faster under the stamp of prohibition than they ever could have under tolerance. Pamphlets mocking his mistress's tracts, denouncing taxation treatises, dismantling absolutism, all circulated with the thrill of forbidden fruit. Each reader who turned a page in secret felt a kind of defiance. Each whispered debate in a coffeehouse rehearsed the future. Thus the monarchy, by clamping down, taught its people to look elsewhere for truth. And once a population learns to doubt the king's words and trust a hidden library, instead the spell of monarchy is broken. On January 5, 1757, as Louis XV left Versailles for Trianon, a man lunged from the crowd and stabbed him with a small knife. The blade barely pierced the skin, it left little more than a shallow wound on the king's side. But the gesture was enough to send shockwaves through France. The would-be assassin was Robert François Damiens, a former servant dismissed embittered and steeped in rumours of royal corruption and public suffering. He did not belong to a faction or conspiracy. He carried no manifesto. When questioned, his answers were muddled, his motives unclear, yet the act itself required no explanation in the climate of debt defeat and scandal. The very idea that a common man might strike at the sacred body of the king spoke louder than any pamphlet. The attempt was universally condemned in words, yet privately many understood it. Not that they approved, but that it felt legible. The monarchy's failures had made even regicide imaginable. If one desperate servant could lift a knife against the well-beloved, perhaps the bond between sovereign and people had already been cut. Louis recovered quickly from the wound, but the monarchy did not recover from the message. The trial and execution of Damiens became a theatre of horror. He was condemned to the traditional punishment for regicide to be broken on the wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, molten lead, and boiling oil poured into the wounds his limbs quartered by horses. The crowd filled the Place de Grève, some in fascination, others in grim silence. Rumours swirled that the horses failed to pull his body apart, cleanly prolonging his agony. Whether exaggerated or not, the spectacle entered memory as one of the most grotesque executions in French history. What was meant to reaffirm royal authority had the opposite effect. To some, it demonstrated desperation, the monarchy clinging to terror because it had lost love. To others, it confirmed the cruelty of a system willing to destroy a man so savagely even if his crime had drawn no blood. The theatre of punishment turned the knife wound into an imaginal scar that would not fade. In taverns and cafes, whispers lingered. The king had been touched, and nothing could erase that. The sanctity of the monarch's body, once considered untouchable, had been breached. The wound was shallow, but its meaning was deep. It proved that even a king could be reached by the hand of desperation. From that day, Louis XV could never again fully embody the aura of inviolability. The knife that missed still landed in the imagination of his people in the erosion of his myth. If the knife of Damiens had pierced the myth of inviolability, foreign policy soon exposed the monarchy's paralysis. Nowhere was this clearer than in the slow dismemberment of Poland. Poland had long been tied to France by dynastic threads and shared Catholic identity. Louis XV himself had married Marie Leszczyńska, daughter of a Polish king briefly raised to the throne with French support. For decades, Paris styled itself as Poland's protector against its voracious neighbours, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Yet when those neighbours moved to partition Poland in the 1760s, carving away whole provinces in a cynical act of balance of power arithmetic, France barely stirred. This failure was not born of indifference alone, but of incapacity. Versailles was trapped in webs of faction ministers, feuded ambassadors, contradicted one another, and decisions were delayed until events had already passed them by. Unlike the Sun King, who had once bent European courts to his tempo, Louis XV presided over a France that reacted rather than orchestrated. Diplomacy became a mirror of his hesitation, responding to crises instead of setting the stage. The optics were brutal. In Vienna, Berlin and St. Petersburg, statesmen recalibrated. If France, once conductor of Europe's symphony, could not defend an old ally, then its battle no longer mattered. Allies grew cautious, enemies emboldened. Britain, already ascendant on the seas, mocked France as a power of memory rather than momentum. For ordinary Frenchmen, the partition of Poland felt distant in geography, but close in meaning. Pamphlets and coffeehouse debates cast it as another humiliation, proof that their king had abandoned honour abroad as surely as he neglected justice at home. Once France had been feared for its ability to shift the map of Europe with a treaty or a war, now it seemed reduced to watching from the sidelines while others redrew borders. The loss was intangible but corrosive, the erosion of diplomatic initiative, the slow realization that France no longer set the tempo of continental politics. And when the conductor loses tempo, the orchestra does not wait. It finds another to follow. By the 1760s, Louis XV faced not only foreign humiliation and financial collapse, but also rebellion from within his own institutions. At the centre of this storm stood the Parlement. The high courts of justice spread across France, with the Parlement of Paris as the most powerful. In theory, they were judicial bodies tasked with registering royal edicts. In practice, they had become political actors wielding their right of remonstrance, the ability to delay or protest legislation, as a weapon. The Parlement magistrates were not revolutionaries. They were nobles of the robe, wealthy men in long black gowns, defenders of privilege as much as of justice. Yet their opposition to royal edicts, particularly new taxes, cast them in the role of tribunes for the nation. Each time they resisted crowds gathered outside their chambers, treating their defiance as if it were the voice of the people. The king saw defiance, the public saw conscience. What unfolded was less governance than theatre. Whenever the crown issued a fiscal edict, the Parlement responded with solemn remonstrances drafted in lofty language about liberty and the ancient rights of the kingdom. Louis would reply with a lit de justice, arriving in person at the court seated beneath a canopy and commanding the magistrates to register his law. The rituals were elaborate, the language thunderous, but behind the pageantry lay stalemate. In 1753, the magistrates of Paris went so far as to refuse registration altogether, prompting Louis to exile them to distant provinces. The act shocked the public, who treated the exiled judges as martyrs. When the king later recalled them, it was interpreted not as mercy but as weakness. By the later 1760s, tensions hardened into paralysis. Louis XV, urged on by his Chancellor Maupeou, finally moved to break the deadlock. In 1771, he dissolved the Parliament of Paris and replaced it with a new body loyal to the crown. It was an attempt to restore authority to cut the knot of endless remonstrance. But the gesture convinced no one. To critics, it looked like tyranny. To supporters, it arrived too late. The irony was cruel. Absolutism, a system designed to eliminate dissent, now found itself trapped in ritualized confrontation with its own courts. Policy gave way to pageantry robes and canopies, speeches and exiles. Decisions that might have saved France's finances were smothered in ceremony. In the eyes of the people, the monarchy no longer governed. It quarrelled, and a crown that quarrels in public begins to look less like destiny, more like dysfunction. As Louis XV entered the twilight of his reign, a final figure stepped into the royal orbit, Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry. Her arrival at Versailles in 1769 was not simply another royal dalliance. It was a scandal that exposed how far the monarchy had fallen in the eyes of its own court and people. Du Barry was not noble. She was the daughter of a seamstress, a former courtesan whose beauty and wit had carried her upward through Parisian salons. To a society obsessed with lineage, her presence at the king's side was an outrage. Where Pompadour had at least cloaked her influence in patronage and refinement, Du Barry flaunted her position with open ease. For nobles whose families traced their bloodlines back centuries, being forced to bow to her was humiliation distilled into ritual. Versailles seethed with resentment. Pamphlets mocked her origins, calling her the whore who wore a crown's shadow. Ministers bristled at her presence in councils. Even Marie Antoinette, the young Austrian Dauphine, refused to acknowledge a snub that echoed loudly through the court. Yet Louis XV clung to her, finding in her company the warmth and distraction his failing reign could no longer provide. Behind the sneers, however, lay politics. Du Barry became a lightning rod for the monarchy's discontent, the embodiment of everything critics despised: indulgence, favouritism, moral collapse. She was accused of steering policy, of selling offices, of draining the treasury charges, often exaggerated, sometimes wholly invented. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the image a king in decline, guided not by ministers or duty, but by intimacy and desire. It is tempting to see Du Barry as the cause of decay. In reality, she was its symptom. The monarchy had long since lost its grip on finances, prestige, and legitimacy, but public outrage needs a face, and Jeanne Bécu provided one. By reducing systemic collapse to the figure of a mistress, both nobles and commoners avoided confronting deeper truths: that absolutism itself was crumbling, that privilege was bankrupting the state, that the edifice of monarchy was already hollow. Still, symbols matter. When smallpox struck Louis XV in April 1774, Du Barry was at his side, comforting him as the disease consumed his body. Yet within days she was expelled from Versailles, by order of the royal family, cast out as though her presence might stain the monarchy further. The final intimacy of his reign was erased in shame. In the end, Du Barry was less an architect of collapse than a mirror of it. Through her, France saw its king not as sovereign but as ordinary, not as sovereign but as indulgent. She was the last favour of a monarch who had traded grandeur for comfort, and whose people would soon demand reckoning. In April of 1774, Louis XV complained of fatigue and headaches while staying at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry. At first, his physicians dismissed it as exhaustion, the aches of a man long accustomed to indulgence. But when the rash appeared, red rising unmistakable, the verdict was swift and merciless: smallpox. In the 18th century, smallpox was a spectre that haunted Europe. It killed indiscriminately peasants, nobles, even monarchs. It scarred faces, blinded children, emptied nurseries. Louis himself had survived childhood illness, but this strain was vicious. Once the pustules spread across his body, the disease advanced with grotesque speed. His handsome features swelled beyond recognition, his skin erupted with sores that oozed foulness. The stench grew so unbearable that courtiers could barely enter his chamber. Versailles, once perfumed with incense and roses, reeked of rot. The physicians tried their arsenal: bleeding, purging poultices, remedies that drained strength rather than restored it. Variolation. A crude form of inoculation was known in parts of Europe by then, but Louis's court had resisted it too. Foreign, too uncertain, too much like tempting fate. Now, with contagion raging, it was too late. The king's body became both battlefield and surrender. Fear spread faster than the fever. Smallpox was contagious, its miasma believed to linger in fabric, air, even letters. Servants deserted their posts. Courtiers who had once schemed for the honour of attending the king now fled through Versailles' gilded corridors. Ritual disintegrated. The lever and coucher, the processions and ceremonies that defined monarchy all fell silent. Etiquette could dictate the angle of a bow, but not the panic of infection. Louis himself could not bear the sight of his decline. He ordered mirrors removed from his chambers so that he would not see the ruin of his own face. A king once obsessed with dignity now recoiled from his reflection, as if the truth of his body exposed the truth of his reign. In anthropology there is a cruel but revealing law. The body of the sovereign is supposed to be more than flesh. It is the body politic, the vessel of the state. When that body decays in public, the illusion collapses. At Versailles, the theatre of monarchy dissolved under biology. The courtiers trained for centuries to treat the king as semi-divine now saw him as mortal, diseased, contagious. Only a handful remained at his side, doctors bound by duty priests who risked infection, to hear his confession, servants too loyal or too terrified of disgrace to abandon him. Du Barry herself was banished from his presence, sent away by the royal family in an act of symbolic cleansing. The king, who had wrapped himself in intimacy and favourites, now faced death stripped of them. The verdict was written on his skin. Every pustule, every groan, every fleeing courtier testified monarchy's aura of immortality had rotted. The body of Louis XV was no longer merely his own. It was the body of France decaying in real time before the eyes of the world. On May 10, 1774, Louis XV breathed his last. What should have been the beginning of mourning became instead the beginning of disposal. The king's body, ravaged by smallpox, bloated, leaking, fetid, could not be put on display in the grand rituals that once sanctified monarchy. The odour alone made it impossible. Even seasoned embalmers gagged and retched, working in short, miserable shifts before abandoning the effort. The solution was haste. His corpse was sealed in a lead-lined coffin, almost immediately, not out of reverence, but of necessity. No lying in state, no majestic procession through Paris. The body was rushed to Saint-Denis, the resting place of kings under cover of night. Guards rode quickly, not solemnly, their task less a ceremony than a hygienic emergency. The contrast with Louis XIV's funeral could not have been starker. The Sun King's passing in 1715 had been choreographed like theatre weeks of public mourning processions designed to remind France of its glory even in loss. Louis XV's, by comparison, felt like a scandal being covered up. Streets that should have been lined with grief were instead filled with indifference or worse, quiet celebration. Bells remained silent in prison churches. Some witnesses recalled that the mood in the city resembled relief, as though a burden had finally been lifted. Foreign observers noticed. Diplomats whispered in letters back to London, Vienna and Berlin that France's king had been buried like a criminal, his body hidden, his rights truncated. Versailles tried to excuse the secrecy on the grounds of public health. But everyone understood the deeper truth. Shame had rewritten the script. Even in Saint-Denis the ritual faltered. The stench seeped through the coffin, overwhelming clergy and mourners. The bishop gagging cut prayers short. It no longer resembled the funeral of a monarch. It resembled the hasty disposal of something dangerous. A funeral is not just burial, it is theatre designed to project continuity. By compressing, abbreviating and hiding Louis XV's last rites, the monarchy destroyed its own illusion. The message was unmistakable here, was a king whose body and reign alike had rotted, unfit for reverence. What should have reaffirmed monarchy instead advertised its collapse. In pamphlets and satirical songs, comparisons abounded. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had died in glory. Louis XV, his heir, had been hurried into the ground like spoiled meat. One had written a script of majesty, the other had left a stench that no incense could mask. It was not a funeral, it was a secret, and secrets rot faster than bodies. When Louis XV's coffin disappeared into Saint-Denis, the crown passed to his 20-year-old grandson Louis XVI. He inherited not only the throne, but the reek of disgrace, the mountain of debt, and a population that had stopped believing in kings. Where once hatred had attached itself to the man, it now clung to the institution itself. The young king was earnest, even pious. He wanted to be a good ruler to restore dignity where his grandfather had squandered it. Yet his inheritance was poisoned. The treasury bled from decades of war. Tax revenues were trapped in a system of privilege that exempted precisely those most able to pay. To change anything meant confronting the nobility and clergy, the very pillars that propped up monarchy. Finance ministers tried. Etienne de Silhouette proposed broadening taxation to all estates, but his austerity measures sparked outrage and earned him mockery. The word silhouette became a term for something thin and unsubstantial. Jean-Baptiste de Machault sought reform but was blocked by vested interests. Later, Turgot and Necker would attempt grander schemes, cutting expenses, tinkering with taxation, experimenting with loans, but the machine refused to bend. Every proposal ran aground on the reefs of privilege. Meanwhile, France leapt into the American Revolutionary War, hoping to avenge humiliations of the 7 Years' War. It was a gamble and an attempt to restore prestige abroad, even while drowning in deficit at home. French soldiers fought with valour. French ships finally bested Britain in certain seas, and the colonies won independence. Yet the victory carried a ruinous price by 1783. The national debt had swollen to catastrophic levels. The irony was cruel. Louis XVI sought honour overseas and returned only with bankruptcy. The public, already disillusioned, saw not triumph but confirmation that their rulers wasted blood and coin for nothing. Pamphlets railed against the King and Queen Marie Antoinette. Foreign and extravagant became a lightning rod for scorn. The language shifted. Where once people muttered about Louis the Well-Beloved, turned Louis the Maligned, they now cursed monarchy itself. The hatred had detached from personality and fused with structure. The problem was no longer one bad king, but the very idea of kingship. Louis XV's rot had made monarchy mortal. Louis XV's failures made it intolerable. And yet in those first years, hope had flickered. Reformers whispered that perhaps this young king, unlike his grandfather, might summon the courage to break privilege and modernize the state. But hope without power is fragile. Louis XVI was earnest but hesitant, his will diluted by court factions and family pressure. He wanted to heal the wound. Instead, he reopened it. Thus, as the 1770s turned into the 1780s, the French crown found itself in an impossible position, despised for its excess, trapped by its own traditions, and teetering under debts so vast that no ritual, no incense, no memory of past grandeur could disguise them. The revolution had not yet begun, but the monarchy was already condemned. Louis XV's death did not only mark the end of a man, it marked the death of an idea, the notion that monarchy in France was immortal, insulated from decay, sanctified by God and spectacle. His reign revealed what happens when personal weakness and structural failure feed each other, until neither can be disentangled. For decades, reform had been possible. Finance ministers pleaded for fairness in taxation, philosophers wrote of accountability, generals begged for coherent strategy. But every attempt was blunted by privilege, delayed by hesitation, drowned in indulgence. By the time change was finally attempted in earnest under his successor, trust had already vanished. When legitimacy dies first, policy cannot save what follows. The lesson is clearest when we look at the body itself. Rumour and record intertwine. In his final weeks, courtiers fleeing the smell mirrors, covered servants gagging at the stench, a coffin sealed in haste. Did it truly smell so foul that even the bishop cut short his prayers? Perhaps accounts exaggerated, perhaps pamphlets embroidered. Yet the myth became truth because it captured what everyone already believed, that France itself was rotting. The body became symbol, and the symbol became verdict. In this way, Louis XV taught his people to read not decrees but signs, the wasted wars, the courtiers whispering in salons, the mistresses elevated above ministers, the ledgers collapsing under privilege. Even those who never saw Versailles learned to pass the kingdom as a suspect text where rot revealed itself in smell long before collapse. Power without responsibility always decays. The French learned this by watching their monarch's body disintegrate before their eyes, but the lesson is older than kings and lasts longer than revolutions. Institutions survive only so long as they answer the needs of those who sustain them. Ignore hunger, dismiss justice, indulge only in privilege, and the pageantry of rule will turn to parody. By 1774, the monarchy had lost not just a king, but the illusion that kingship itself was sacred. The revolution that followed was not born from a single pamphlet or protest. It was born from the recognition that the sovereign smelled like any man, that the divine crown hid only fragile flesh. And once an audience learns to recognize the smell of rot, they never forget it. When a kingdom decays lessons from Louis XV, the story of Louis XV is more than a chronicle of battles lost and coffins sealed in haste. It is a meditation on what happens when power resists responsibility, when ceremony replaces substance, and when private indulgence is mistaken for public duty. His reign began with the promise of renewal, an orphaned boy elevated as le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, in whom a weary France invested its hopes. It ended with a rotting body hurriedly buried to conceal its stench while the people of Paris whispered relief rather than sorrow. What makes this story enduring is not only its historical weight but its universal resonance. We may never rule a kingdom, but we each hold forms of authority over families, workplaces, communities, or even our own character. The lessons drawn from Louis XV's fall reach across centuries. First neglect is as destructive as malice. Louis was not a tyrant in the mould of his great-grandfather. He did not crush dissent with fire and sword. His fault lay in hesitation, avoidance, and a retreat into comfort when duty demanded clarity. In life, the duties we postpone often corrode more deeply than the mistakes we make. Small cracks, ignored responsibilities, deferred decisions spread until the whole structure falters. Second appearances cannot sustain substance. Versailles was a palace of mirrors, its rituals designed to project sacred majesty. But when disease stripped away the veneer, courtiers fled. No choreography could disguise the smell of rot. The same applies beyond thrones in business relationships, and self-image appearances may buy time, but they cannot replace integrity. Eventually, reality asserts itself. Third privilege hardens into poison when it resists reform. Louis XV inherited a system in which nobles and clergy paid little, while peasants bore the weight of taxation. Reformers tried to rebalance the scales, but the king yielded to entrenched interests. The result was collapse. In our own lives, whether leading teams or managing households, refusing to confront unfairness guarantees that problems will worsen. Systems large or small that privilege the few at the expense of the many eventually implode. Fourth, secrecy and shame accelerate decline. The hurried burial of Louis XV was meant to hide disgrace but instead confirmed it. People assumed the worst because they were given no reason to think otherwise. In personal life, hiding mistakes or failures rarely preserves dignity. Transparency, though painful, prevents rumour from becoming a harsher judgment than truth itself. Finally, power is fragile when it loses trust. Louis XV's reign illustrates that authority is not secured by crowns or rituals, but by the confidence of those governed. When trust erodes, even divine right collapses. In everyday life, trust functions the same way it is the foundation of leadership, friendship, and love. Once broken, titles and ceremonies cannot repair it. The life and death of Louis XV remind us that rot is not inevitable. It comes from neglect, avoidance, and the refusal to reform. The lesson for us is simple yet demanding: attend to cracks before they widen, value responsibility over comfort, and remember that legitimacy in any role, parent, leader, friend, is sustained not by appearances, but by care, courage, and trust. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.